haircut. How about a message for the country? I gave that Wednesday night.
Always a little awkward when the winners and losers get together after the election. We're going to talk about that Romney-Obama meeting coming up in just a little bit. But let me bring the roundtable back in. Cokie Roberts is here again. Dan Senor, former advisor to the Romney campaign. Steve Rattner, former advisor to President Obama. And Congressman Tom Cole, Republican of Oklahoma. Keith Ellison, Democrat of Minnesota. I do want to get to that, but we have left a lot on the table on that earlier discussion. So I want to get to that because it really seems like each party is going to have to confront giving up, sacrificing something that's worked for them in the past. Democrats on Medicare, Republicans on taxes. And Keith, you were talking about where a lot of Democrats are going to draw the line on Medicare. And Steve, I know you wanted to answer him.
Look, all I wanted to say is that Democrats have to face up to two fundamental realities. One, that there's divided government, as I said earlier, and so if we want to get something done, there's going to have to be compromise. And second, the math has to work. We have to solve this problem. $16 trillion of debt, $1 trillion of deficit every year. We're not doing seniors or people my age or George's age any favors by leaving Medicare completely untouched because it will not be there for us or our children at the rate we're going. So we can take it out of the providers. I'm all for doing as much of that as possible. That's what we've been doing. There's a limit to how much of that we can do. Then you have to say to yourself, do you want to pay more in taxes for Medicare? Or do you want to adjust the benefits, eligibility, means test it so wealthier people don't get all those benefits? Something on that side. Otherwise, the numbers won't work.
Well, I don't want to see Medicare turn into a welfare program, which is what it would be if wealthier people didn't benefit from it or had a significantly reduced benefit. It needs to be something shared that Americans are all in, that we all participate in and we all contribute to. So I think it's a strong program. As a matter of fact, though, Steve, think about the fact that when we did the Affordable Care Act, we actually lengthened the life of the program. We can do more things like that. Well, I mean, let's continue down that road.
We've talked a lot about demographics this year because of the election. And when we look at Medicare, that's where the problem comes. There's just not enough young people to support all the old people, and they're getting to be fewer young people. I mean, what we're seeing right now is that our immigrant populations are producing fewer children. And so it is really not possible to keep this level of support.
Well, unless you control, there are other ways to control costs as well. I think that's what big part of the debate is.
But the problem with controlling costs, you can only do that to some degree. Every single year, we go back and do the doc fix. In fact, we'll do it between now and January 1st again. And that is always a phony thing.
It raises payments
that
for the
Congress says that they're going to cut payments to doctors, and then doctors pull out of the Medicare program, and Congress
and the money's
goes back
restored. Absolutely.
It's very hard to do this without structural reforms.
Right. Let's talk about the taxes.
If I may, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Look, you know, we have seen people's retirement package reduce. You've seen people's individual savings, their employment-related retirement savings go down. You know, you cannot keep on seeing 401ks go down and savings rates go down and then say we're going to cut the other stuff that people can count on. I mean, we've got to make some...
And that is going to be
the numbers have to work. You've got to get the numbers to work.
I want to turn to the tax debate as well, because
I much more enjoyed this.
You guys are sitting back happy about this.
Pop some popcorn.
So let's get to the tax debate. You've seen Speaker Boehner, other Republicans say we're really going to have more revenues, but this drawing the line on tax rate increases, and Grover Norquist has come out hard again, of course, saying Republicans have to stand by the pledge.
If the Republicans lose in such a way that they've got their fingerprints on the murder weapon, then you have a problem. I mean, Bush couldn't run again in '92 successfully because he had his fingerprints on a very bad deal, which was bad on spending and bad on taxes, and he broke his word.
Is he right about those politics?
You know, I think not, actually, but I think you have to remember our fingerprints aren't on this. If we cooperate with the president and make 80% of the Bush tax cuts permanent for 98% of the American people, that's a victory, not a loss. And then we're still free to try and fight the fight over higher rates, offering revenue, which the speaker's put on the table. Politically, to me, that seems to be a much superior position than a messy deal at the end where it looks like we caved. I think we have the opportunity to take the initiative and actually, again, move the discussion to entitlements.
And what you also avoid there, Dan, is something else that I think some Republicans are worried about, not '92, but 1994, when the government shut down, Newt Gingrich was blamed.
Right. Oh, trust me, you talk to Republicans, that is what they were. They said no matter how this shakes out, if we go over the fiscal cliff, we are blamed. I hear that over and over. I will say, look, there's something to what Tom is saying, which is it is an amazing notion to think that a just elected Democratic president is necessary in order to make permanent the vast majority of Bush's tax cuts. Those were tax cuts, you know, when those tax cuts were demonized by the Democrats, they weren't just the tax rate cuts on the upper income. They were the tax rate cuts across the board. The idea that most of them could be made permanent. I mean, Bush couldn't have gotten that done in 2004 after being reelected. So I do think Republicans should take a victory lap in that regard, even if I'm skeptical of raising the top rate.
It is really politically smart to do this. But it's also politically smart to cut the knees out from under Grover Norquist. I mean, this guy is, who is he? He's an unelected.
But it's not him.
It's not him. That's the point. He's become a straw man. He represents something that's real. He represents something that's real.
The emperor has no clothes.
Yeah,
and to say that is, I think,
his army is melting away, because I think everybody recognizes that to get these numbers to work, you have to have revenue increases. And the question then is, do you need tax rate increases or not? I think it is very tough to make the math work.
I think his army is melting away, because honestly, I think, and I like Grover. I don't have any problem with having signed the pledge. But there's a big, I'll be back, partner. There's a big, big difference between not being able to extend our temporary tax cut. That, to me, is not a violation of the pledge. I didn't sign a pledge that said I have to extend every temporary tax cut. If that was true, I'd have to be for also extending the payroll tax cut. And I think to...
You're not for that?
No, I'm not. Well, look, if you can find a way, great, but I don't like cutting payroll taxes, because the cut's always temporary. It doesn't change things. And you have to fund Social Security. You have to fund Medicare. So, no, I think those are...
But I don't like any of this pledge stuff. What about the pledge to the American people to act fiscally responsibly for everybody? I mean, I actually think that it's great that you made that proposal. And I think that you might find
somebody else thought.
The reality is, in most of the congressional districts where Republicans are today, a lot of them are more concerned about a primary challenge to the re-election than a general election challenge to the re-election. So this Grover Norquist, thing that's been put out there is a little bit of a myth. You're talking about real politics on the ground in these congressional districts. A number of these members ran on strong, fiscal responsible, pro-growth agendas, and it's about staying true to the agendas they ran on. It's not about Grover Norquist.
But you can make a case that it's not fiscally responsible.
I think it's going to be very hard for the Republicans in the end to resist some rate increase. It is very hard to argue why the top 2% of Americans should not see some increase in their marginal...
The president's simply not going to agree to something that doesn't include some kind of rate increase.
The president has been very clear.
That's basically what Congressman Cole is saying.
Compromise involves compromise in both directions. I don't understand why the Republicans are so dug in on this. You're talking about a very small change in marginal rates. I've been in the working world around people making a lot of money for 30 years. I don't see their behavior changing much, whether the tax rate is 35% or 37%.
And that's because a lot of rich people are paying off of dividend and income. And not just payroll.
But it's not about the rich people. You're right, are not affected. It's a lot of businesses and small businesses whose tax at the. But let me just say, I'm about to agree with you on one point, which is that I do think the Republican leadership at some point here needs to put forward publicly its plan. I mean, that is something that it's sort of an awkward negotiation. I do think the president's gone way too far out on the left.
Isn't that what McConnell started to do with the Wall Street Journal on Saturday?
I think you're seeing the beginnings of it, but I do think it's still
small pieces.
Right.
He gave really tiny,
to be fair to Leader McConnell, he's always been very forthright. Look, entitlement reform takes both sides coming together and jumping out together, and then it's not an issue in the next election because they both did it. And I think he very much.
I want to move on, but let me quickly go just around the table. Does this get done before January 1st or not?
Yes.
Probably.
If they say so, I believe it.
Yes.
Probably.
Wow. I'm going to be the only no. We'll see what happens.
Really?
Okay, yeah, let's move on, at least for a few days. We'll see. Let's move on to Susan Rice right now. You saw last week on this show, Lindsey Graham, and in other shows, other Republicans start to suggest that they were more open to the idea, at least, that she might be Secretary of State. But then she went up to Capitol Hill this week and listened to the senators after the meetings with you and Ambassador Rice.
I continue to be troubled by the fact that the UN ambassador decided to play what was essentially a political role.
We are significantly troubled by many of the answers that we got and some that we didn't get.
The concerns I have are greater today than they were before.
I got to say, Cookie, I was surprised by all that. Usually you don't go up to a meeting like that unless you have some idea of how it's going to turn out.
It is surprising, but I think what we're dealing with to some degree is something that Dan was just talking about, which is that Republicans, particularly Senator Graham, are more worried about their primaries than their general elections. And there is some amount of trying to prove your conservative credentials here. And I think that, that Senator Graham has been out there on issues like immigration and other issues where conservatives are not with him, and to sort of go on the attack against Ambassador Rice might...
You're shaking your head.
Because it's not just Senator Graham. It's Susan Collins, a moderate from Maine who introduced
her. Yeah.
Who introduced Susan Rice at her confirmation hearing. It's Bob Corker, the incoming ranking Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who's very much a moderate, very much works across party lines. I know Steve has worked with him. These are not firebrands, and these are not people worried about primary challenges. I spoke to one senator who met with her this week. The consensus this individual conveyed was that these meetings did not go well. Benghazi was a serious issue. We can debate whether or not Susan Rice should be blamed for it, but she was front and center on a very serious issue, and I think the administration has handled this terribly. They have put her out there as though she's going to be a nominee, except they haven't nominated her. You know, Jay Carney's being asked questions, asked the defender. He says, I'm not going to speculate about someone. She hasn't been nominated for anything. And now she's under the media onslaught of her investments and companies in Iran and investments in Canada, so she gets all the downside of being a nominee without any of the infrastructure and administration support for her.
So we can talk about how the administration's handled it and debate that. But what I don't believe, I think what she did was entirely appropriate. She was given a set of talking points done by nonpartisan intelligence agencies in which we, to the best of our knowledge, the White House changed exactly one word, an innocuous word.
Not the White House, the intelligence, but the intelligence agency did.
Consulate mission, and she went out there and she did it. And now she's being torn apart for it. It's as if when George was interviewing Tim Geithner, he had said, you know, Tim Geithner was supposed to have gone and added up all the numbers in their budget proposal to make sure they're right. This is what people...
If she were the nominee, there'd be a whole infrastructure there to support her. There'd be a war room.
Right.
And none of that is the case. So she's just kind of hung out there.
White House has done a terrible disservice. But
I think that she's being treated horribly. She's done...
By the administration, too.
Well, I think she's done really good work. I mean, it was her who really went out there and helped get the consensus for the no-fly zone in Libya. I mean, that was hard work to do. She came through. She came through for the people attacking her right now, like Senator McCain and others. I think it's really an unfortunate circumstance. This woman is a great
And wonder what else, Dan, here, and let me bring this to Congressman Cole. How much of this is about the merits of the issue, and how much of this has to do with some Senate politics as well? Senator Kerry, everyone knows that he's the follow.
I would like to believe not much has to do with politics. Look, there's a legitimate concern that she was used 5 days after the fact to propagate a story that we should have known at the time was not the case. And there are some serious questions here, by the way, about our own intelligence people. We saw President Bush out front defending something we found out later wasn't true, too. Maybe we should ask those guys some questions. But you want a Secretary of State in the end that can unite you, not divide you, and that can speak forcefully for the country. Secretary Clinton, frankly, has managed to do that. I'm not convinced that Ambassador Rice will be able to.
Let me bring this to you then, Koki. So what does the president do right now? Here, if you take them at their word, he had not made up his mind to choose Susan Rice. It was between Susan Rice and John Kerry. You could look at the politics either way. On the one hand, you say, boy, he can't back down to this opposition in the Senate. On the other hand, is this a fight
he wants to have? And having a nomination fight over Secretary of State is really an unusual and shocking thing. And so I think that probably in the end, he doesn't do it. But I do think that it is... but he... Again, he put her in this position, and then she gets the opposition, and then he says, well, I can't name you. I mean, it's unfair. And I'm not, maybe in the end he realizes that and says,
but is this a fight that would necessarily hurt the president?
Well, I don't think we should link whether or not what happened in Benghazi and whether she gets the nomination. I would hate to conclude that the reason she doesn't get that nomination is because of this stuff that just happened. They're not necessarily connected. And I just want to...
Talk radio is just full of Benghazi. I mean, it's a big issue.
Which is amazing to me. You know, in 1982, we lost 241 Marines in Lebanon. Right. And the country came around President Reagan. You didn't see all this partisan bickering.
Well, we invaded Grenada the next day.
Wait a minute.
No, we didn't. We came together and said that this is a national tragedy and a blame was not parceled out the way it is now. And I think it's unfortunate.
You look at 1982, there was an airing, there was accountability, there was an outlet for accountability. Part of the problem here is in the lead up to the election, when Benghazi got a lot of attention, the president said, don't talk about Benghazi. If you do, you're politicizing the issue. So you weren't allowed, Romney and others weren't allowed to talk about it in the political context. Here we are after the election, and there's no full airing. We still don't know exactly what happened. So it's common for personnel fights to become
But wait a second. I want to hold. That may be true, but is it really about what happened on a Sunday show? I mean, there are legitimate questions about what was the security situation at the mission in Benghazi. Why wasn't there more security? But that's not her job.
There are two separate issues. One is what happened in Benghazi, and there is an investigation going on by two very high-level, distinguished people, and we will get a report, and then we can debate that, and that's a fair debate to have as to how Benghazi was handled. I don't believe that what's being done to Susan Rice right now is fair. It's politics, it's ugly, and it may force the president not to nominate her, but I don't think it's fair.
But this political part about it is not only just the upset over Benghazi. There is the internal Senate politics. And John Kerry, now he's not always been a favorite of his colleagues, but they seem to be supporting him now. But there's also the question of if he leaves the Senate, who gets elected in Massachusetts.
That would have been the case. Look, I think everyone understands that John Kerry is going to be nominated for something. If it's not for Secretary of State, it could be for Secretary of Defense. This idea that they're holding up Susan Rice because of this plan to get Scott Brown maybe elected, I just think
that's too much.
It's too much. I just want to come back to something. Look, there is this investigation going on in Benghazi, but there are certain things that we can get basic answers to. There was a complete security vacuum in Libya before September 11th, 2012. There was. I mean, there were transactional terrorist groups who were able to fill that vacuum. Our security was dependent on these local Libya militia. These are things we know. What happened on September 11th? What the president did in the Situation Room on September 11th? These are things he knows. What happened after September 11th in terms of how the administration communicated to the American public? They don't have to wait for Chip Pickering to do an investigation. These are basic questions that can be answered, and they haven't been, which is why you see one opening, which is this possible nomination of Susan Rice becoming this proxy.
And that nomination would become an entire investigation of Benghazi. That's what that nomination would become.
But Susan Rice was not responsible for Benghazi.
I understand that.
And if these guys have all the questions, all those good questions you just asked, if they have all those good questions you just asked, they should ask those questions and not start talking about Susan Rice.
Yeah, the president has to make a decision here. Do I really want this fight?
Right.
Is this really going to be helpful? Is this in the best interest of the country? Is this person so indispensable that that's the only person I can find to be Secretary of State? Or do I avoid the fight, find somebody else that's perfectly acceptable, perfectly defensible? You know, my money is he probably comes down there. He's going to have plenty of fights. This is not one I would go pick.
We have a couple minutes left. I want to put up that picture we saw of Mitt Romney and President Obama in the Oval Office this week and ask Dan Senor. You know, it was the statement that came out of the White House was about as tepid as a statement could be, saying maybe if there's something comes up in the future they can work together, they might find a way to do it. Do you have any insight into what really happened?
Not much that I can get into, other than to say, other than to say, no. They both actually, both President Obama and Governor Romney agreed that they would keep this a pretty close hold. I think it was a very respectful discussion. I think it was an interesting discussion, probably more interesting than some of those images you showed earlier of Gore Bush and some of these other win-loss get-togethers. I take President Obama at his word, what he said publicly at that press conference after his election, that there's some ideas that Governor Romney put forward that he thinks are interesting. I think they may have talked about some of those issues. I think they'll have an open channel of communication. I don't think there's going to be that much more.
And what are Republicans going to be looking to Mitt Romney to do in the future?
You know, probably raise a lot of money. Honestly, he did build a tremendous infrastructure during the course of his campaign. And he had a great campaign team and staff around him. You know, who he supports in 2016 will matter if he chooses to do that.
Okay, we have to take one more quick break. And as we look at this Good Samaritan photo that rocketed around the world this week, the roundtable when we come back is going to weigh in on where they find hope in politics. That's next.
This week.